Let me be direct with you from the outset because what unfolded on May 9th, 2026 demands directness. What we witnessed was not a routine diplomatic exchange. It was not another bilateral trade agreement. What we witnessed was the beginning of the end of dollar hegemony in global energy markets, and most people watching the news that evening had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. I am looking at a joint communique released simultaneously in Tehran and Beijing at 1447 GMT that has been circulating among currency traders and central bank officials for the past 96 hours. What it announces is not a symbolic gesture. It is not a pilot program. It is not a framework for future cooperation. What it announces is a fully operational, WAN-denominated oil trading mechanism bypassing SWIFT entirely, processing Iran's entire crude oil export volume to China, which currently represents 98% of Iranian oil exports. That is 4 million barrels per day moving outside the dollar system starting June 1st, 2026. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this single phone call represents the most significant challenge to dollar supremacy since the 1971 Nixon shock, why Saudi Arabia is now facing an impossible choice between Washington and Beijing, and why the price you pay at the pump in 6 months will be determined in Shanghai, not New York. This is the Professor Marandi Report. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by Treasury officials in Washington, London, and Riyadh right now. This is not speculation. This is documentation. Let's start with the architecture of the current system, because understanding what just broke requires understanding how it was built. The petrodollar system, established between 1973 and 1974, rests on a simple arrangement. Saudi Arabia and OPEC members price oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States provides military protection and maintains strategic petroleum reserves. This creates artificial global demand for dollars because every nation purchasing oil must first acquire dollars to complete the transaction. That dollar demand allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits while maintaining currency strength, what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called America's exorbitant privilege in 1965. The system depends on universal participation. When Iraq announced in 2000 it would accept euros for oil, American policymakers treated it as a strategic threat, not merely an economic decision. When Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency for oil sales in 2009, NATO intervention followed within 2 years. The pattern is consistent. Challenges to dollar oil pricing are treated as challenges to American power itself because they are. Iran has been under comprehensive sanctions since 2018, when the Trump administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and reimposed what Treasury officials described as maximum pressure. Those sanctions explicitly target any financial institution processing Iranian oil transactions. European banks, Asian clearing houses, even Chinese state banks have historically complied because the cost of dollar system exclusion exceeds the profit from Iranian oil trade. Until now, Iran has been forced to use elaborate workarounds, barter arrangements, front companies, and unofficial exchanges, all of which carry massive transaction costs and risk premiums. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Iran produced approximately 1 million barrels per day in 2025, with 4 million barrels exported almost exclusively to China. China imported 2 million barrels of oil per day in 2025, making it the world's largest crude importer. Iranian oil represents roughly 5% of Chinese imports. That percentage matters. It is large enough to justify infrastructure investment, but small enough that disruption would not cripple Chinese energy security. China has been preparing for this transition not because Iran demanded it, but because China sees strategic advantage in breaking dollar dependence. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about what actually happened on May 9th. Announcement number 1, the digital yuan oil settlement system went live. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents 7 years of infrastructure building that Western analysts dismissed as theoretical. At 11:22 a.m. Beijing time, Iranian Oil Minister Javad Oji and Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao conducted a video call lasting 23 minutes. According to the joint statement released afterward and confirmed by Reuters, the two officials activated a bilateral crude oil trading platform operating entirely in digital yuan, bypassing the SWIFT international payment system, the clearinghouse interbank payment system, and all dollar-denominated settlement mechanisms. The platform uses blockchain verification, settling transactions in under 4 minutes with transaction costs below 0.08% compared to traditional correspondent banking fees ranging from 2% to 7%. The scale is not experimental. According to Chinese customs data and confirmed by Platts oil market reporting, the system will process 4 million barrels per day, valued at approximately $114 million daily at current prices, or $6 billion annually. That is $6 billion in oil trade that no longer requires dollar acquisition, no longer generates dollar demand, no longer passes through New York clearing houses, and no longer remains visible to U.S. Treasury monitoring. Commander of U.S. Central Command, General Michael Kurilla, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in March 2026 and stated, I am quoting him directly here, that Iran's integration into alternative payment systems represents a capability gap in our sanctions enforcement architecture. That testimony was delivered 5 weeks before this system went operational. The Pentagon knew this was coming. They simply had no mechanism to prevent it. Iran currently operates approximately 44 oil tankers in what shipping analysts call the ghost fleet, vessels with transponders often disabled, insurance provided by non-Western underwriters, and destination ports primarily in China. These tankers no longer need to disguise their cargo origin, engage in ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, or route payments through shell companies in Dubai and Malaysia. The transaction now occurs government to government, yuan to rial, with Chinese state-owned oil companies purchasing directly from the National Iranian Oil Company. The entire compliance structure that sustained sanctions for 8 years just became obsolete. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. Saudi Arabia is now facing a choice it cannot avoid. This is the part currency strategists have been warning about since 2022, but the timeline just accelerated dramatically. Saudi Arabia holds the swing position in global oil markets. Its 2 million barrels per day of production and its willingness to adjust output to stabilize prices give Riyadh unmatched influence. But that influence depends on market unity. When the second largest buyer of oil, China, demonstrates it can operate entirely outside the dollar system, every other oil exporter immediately calculates whether they should demand the same option. China imported 4 million barrels per day from Saudi Arabia in 2025, making it Saudi Arabia's largest customer, exceeding even combined European demand. According to Bloomberg and confirmed by Saudi Aramco investor briefings, those imports generated approximately $81 billion in revenue for the kingdom in 2025. That revenue currently requires dollar settlement because of the 1974 agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia establishing dollar pricing. But the agreement was never a treaty. It was never ratified. It is a diplomatic understanding backed by military cooperation and weapons sales. In March 2023, China brokered a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, restoring diplomatic relations severed in 2016. That mediation signaled shifting Gulf political alignments. In January 2026, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Beijing and signed preliminary agreements on yuan-denominated oil futures trading on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. Western analysts treated those agreements as symbolic. They were not symbolic. They were preparation. Here is the calculation Riyadh now faces. If Saudi Arabia maintains dollar-only pricing, while Iran and potentially Russia, Venezuela, and others offer yuan alternatives, Chinese buyers will increasingly preference non-Saudi oil to reduce their own dollar exposure. Saudi market share in China erodes. Alternatively, if Saudi Arabia opens yuan settlement for even a portion of Chinese sales, the petrodollar system fractures. Once the world's largest oil exporter permits non-dollar payment, every other producer will demand the same flexibility. The dollar's structural demand advantage disappears. American officials have made clear, in private conversations reported by the Wall Street Journal and Foreign Policy magazine, that Saudi acceptance of yuan for oil would be treated as a fundamental breach of the security partnership. But the same officials cannot answer the question of what mechanism exists to prevent it. Sanctions against Saudi Arabia are geopolitically unthinkable. Military pressure is equally untenable. The United States needs Saudi cooperation in Yemen, in balancing Iranian influence, in stabilizing oil markets themselves. Riyadh knows this. Beijing knows this. Tehran certainly knows this. Think carefully about what this represents. For 52 years, oil producers had no alternative to the dollar system. The infrastructure did not exist. The yuan was not convertible. Chinese demand was insufficient to justify separate payment rails. All of those constraints just evaporated in a single coordinated phone call. The monopoly broke not through military confrontation, not through treaty renegotiation, but through patient infrastructure development and strategic timing. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where American policymakers are realizing they have no prepared response. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. Russia is now accelerating its own yuan pivot, and the coordination is not coincidental. Russia exported 3 million barrels per day of crude oil and refined products in 2025, according to the International Energy Agency. China purchased approximately 9 million barrels per day of that total, making China Russia's largest customer. Following Western sanctions imposed after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia already shifted significant oil trade into yuan, but much of that trade still used intermediary banks with dollar exposure. The Iran-China system that just launched provides a template for complete sanctions evasion. On May 11th, just 48 hours after the Tehran-Beijing announcement, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak stated in an interview with TASS that Russia is prepared to expand yuan-based energy settlements, quote, with all interested partners. That phrasing, all interested partners, is diplomatic code for any nation willing to bypass Western payment systems. Combined, Iran and Russia represent approximately 3 million barrels per day flowing to China outside dollar systems. That is roughly 29% of Chinese oil imports denominated in yuan, not dollars. The compounding effect is exponential, not linear. When one supplier offers yuan payment, it is an alternative. When multiple major suppliers coordinate yuan payment, it becomes infrastructure. Chinese refiners can now plan procurement strategies entirely in yuan. Chinese banks can offer yuan-denominated trade finance for oil. Yuan crude oil futures traded on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, which launched in 2018 but struggled for liquidity, suddenly have underlying physical delivery mechanisms supporting price discovery. The entire parallel market ecosystem activates. Venezuela, which exported 580,000 barrels per day in 2025 primarily to China according to Reuters shipping data, has already signaled interest in joining the yuan system to evade U.S. sanctions. The United Arab Emirates, which operates as a major trading hub and re-exporter, has expanded yuan clearing operations in Dubai. Even Angola and Nigeria, traditional Western-aligned African oil producers, are quietly exploring yuan invoicing options for their Chinese sales. Each defection reduces dollar demand, which reduces the United States' ability to run trade deficits without inflationary consequences, which reduces American fiscal flexibility, which reduces the credibility of future sanctions threats. It is a reinforcing cycle. The facade of universality is cracking. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story being covered is sanctions evasion. Headlines describe this as Iran and China circumventing American restrictions, as if it were a temporary workaround by sanctioned states operating at the margins. That framing is actively misleading. What is actually happening is the construction of an alternative global financial architecture by the world's second largest economy. China's GDP reached $2 trillion in 25. Its trade volume exceeds that of the United States. It holds $2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. When China builds payment infrastructure, it is not a workaround. It is a foundation. American officials responded predictably. Treasury Secretary appointed in 2025 issued a statement on May 10th warning that entities facilitating sanctions evasion would face secondary sanctions and asset freezes. That threat has been repeated for 8 years. It has not prevented this system from launching. Why? Because the cost-benefit calculation shifted. China already faces technology sanctions, export controls, and investment restrictions. Additional Treasury sanctions no longer carry marginal deterrent value. The threat lost its power through overuse. European allies have been noticeably silent. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued no joint statement condemning the Iran-China arrangement. No European energy officials called for coordinated response. That silence is itself a verdict. European leaders recognize they lack leverage over Chinese financial decisions and have no interest in further antagonizing Beijing over American sanctions they privately consider counterproductive. When the United States conducts financial warfare and its closest allies decline to participate, that is not diplomatic nuance. That is isolation. Think carefully about what this represents. For 30 years, American sanctions were treated as universal law because the cost of defiance exceeded any benefit. The dollar's role as global reserve currency meant exclusion from dollar systems was economic suicide. But when the second largest economy creates functional alternatives, and when the largest energy importers choose those alternatives, the enforcement mechanism breaks. Sanctions become a tool that works only on nations without alternatives. That is not power. That is pretense. If you own investments in dollar-denominated assets, if you hold treasury bonds, if your retirement accounts are positioned for continued dollar strength, what is happening between Tehran and Beijing is not a foreign policy story. It is a portfolio risk story. The assumption underlying those positions, that the dollar's reserve currency status is structurally permanent, is being tested in real time by nations representing 45% of global GDP and 35% of global oil trade. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta, the two dominant Greek powers, fought for 27 years from 431 to 404 BCE. Both sides exhausted their treasuries, depleted their populations, destroyed their alliances. And who won? Persia. The Persian Empire played both sides, providing loans and resources to whichever city-state seemed weaker, ensuring the conflict continued until both were broken. By the war's end, Persia controlled Greek political outcomes without conquering a single Greek city. The parallel is exact. The United States imposes maximum pressure on Iran. Iran retaliates with regional proxy operations and nuclear program advancement. Both sides expend resources, credibility, and strategic focus. And who wins? China. Beijing mediates peace agreements, builds payment infrastructure, signs long-term energy contracts at discounted prices. China gains everything it needs: Iranian oil below market rates, diplomatic influence in Tehran, leverage over Riyadh, dollar system alternatives, without firing a shot or losing a soldier. American and Iranian focus remains locked on each other, while Chinese structural power expands unopposed. The United States is Athens, convinced its naval superiority and alliance network guarantee victory. Iran is Sparta, smaller but resilient and ideologically committed. China is Persia, patient, strategic, perfectly content to let its rivals exhaust themselves. History suggests how this ends. It does not end with the combatants victorious. And so where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1: dollar system adaptation. The United States and its allies recognize the multipolar currency reality, negotiate yuan-dollar coexistence frameworks, and maintain reserve currency status through competitive advantages in financial depth, legal protections, and innovation rather than monopoly positioning. This requires acknowledging that sanctions overuse has created demand for alternatives and that Chinese economic scale makes those alternatives viable. It requires difficult conversations about American fiscal policy and trade deficits. Politically, this path is extraordinarily difficult because it requires admitting the unipolar moment has ended. But it is the path that preserves the most American influence in the emerging system. Path 2: escalation and fragmentation. The United States treats the yuan oil system as an unacceptable challenge, imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese banks and state oil companies, and attempts to force third countries to choose between dollar access and Chinese trade. This accelerates bloc formation, with dollar zone and yuan zone economies operating parallel systems with minimal integration. Global trade volumes decline. Supply chains fracture along geopolitical lines. Oil prices become increasingly volatile as markets segment. This path preserves American control over its own bloc, but shrinks that bloc's relative size. It is Cold War II, zero applied to currency systems. Path 3: dollar decline and crisis adjustment. The UN oil system expands rapidly. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other major producers begin dual currency pricing. Dollar demand falls faster than U.S. policymakers anticipated. Treasury yields spike as foreign central banks reduce dollar reserve holdings. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between defending currency value through rate hikes that trigger domestic recession or accepting inflation through continued fiscal deficits. A currency crisis forces emergency multilateral negotiations on new reserve system architecture, potentially including special drawing rights expansion or a basket currency approach. This is the disorderly transition scenario. It is also the scenario most likely to occur if American policy remains reactive rather than strategic. I think we are closer to path 3 than the headlines suggest. The reason is simple. The infrastructure is already built. The economic incentives are aligned. The geopolitical will exists in Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, and increasingly in other capitals. The only factor preventing rapid yuan expansion in oil trade was network effects and first-mover risk. Iran and China just solved both. The first-mover risk is gone because the system is operational. Network effects begin reinforcing in the opposite direction every time another producer joins. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, how quickly will Saudi Arabia follow Iran's example, and what will the American response actually be? Not the rhetorical response, the functional policy response. Second, how do currency markets reprice dollar assets when 10%, then 20%, then 30% of global oil trade exits dollar settlement? And third, what does energy security mean for import-dependent nations when currency choice becomes a geopolitical weapon? Tell me in the comments what you think the Saudi decision will be. Tell me if you think the Federal Reserve has any mechanism to prevent this transition or if they are simply managing decline velocity. We will keep tracking every development in Shanghai, Tehran, Riyadh, and Moscow. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand why their investment portfolio assumptions might be catastrophically wrong. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update when Saudi Arabia makes its choice, and we will see you in the next report.